So, to continue our discussion of issues in the 21st century, we need to treat what is perhaps at least for some, the defining issue of ANC rule, and that is political corruption, right? And this is a problem that has bedeviled many African countries in the post-colonial environment, where the party apparatus takes over many of the roles of the state, and a protection system is put into place to keep the party in power and to keep the key figures in the party in both money and political influence. Often this is accompanied by the setting up of networks of patronage, where the key figures within the political party, which has become more or less coterminous with the government in general, shower favors on family members, on friends, on people within their kinship networks, and in some places at least, people who share the same ethnicity as them. Now, the ethnicity issue has not been such a problem in South Africa, partly because Mandela and others in the ANC were very careful early on to not make this a Xhosa-only kind of conclave, right? Mandela was Xhosa, Mbeki was as well, but Zuma, the heir apparent of Mbeki, is a Zulu, and Cyril Ramaphosa, the current president, is a Venda. And so, the ANC is able to span across the different ethnicities, and the waning in power and influence of the Inkatha Freedom Party mitigates the possibility that there will be patronage networks that run through these ethnic groups. But certainly the corruption of setting up patronage networks with family and friends and people with whom they want to create a political debt or a political relationship has been the case in South Africa, unfortunately. And so, this is a very complex topic. It's one that we could spend a lot of time on and delve into a lot of details, as with most of these things. But let me just cover a few points here, right? So, the early 21st century saw the rise politically and socially and economically of these figures who were called in the South African press the tenderpreneurs. And this is a combination of two words: tendering, which is the profiting off of handling government contracts, government tenders, where the government contracts with an individual or with a company to carry out operations, and often pays handsomely for this. The ANC, or I should say, figures within the liberation struggle who had been members of the ANC, and in the early years of the democracy, some of them withdrew from politics and instead became these tenderpreneurs. The most spectacular example probably is Cyril Ramaphosa, who, after being a key negotiator in the constitutional talks in the early 1990s, was passed over for the deputy president slot in favor of Thabo Mbeki. And Ramaphosa, for a time, retired from politics, became a businessman, but mostly a government contractor, as it were, and amassed a fortune of several billion rand, right? I think his estimated worth is somewhere between 10 and 15 billion rand, which would be about $1 billion or so, maybe a little more than that, depending on the exchange rate currently. And Ramaphosa was one. There was another ANC figure, Tokyo Sekwale, who was accused of corruption, in fact indicted for it at one point, but was another one of these tenderpreneurs. And this was done, I guess, with at least the tacit approval of the ANC leaders, including perhaps even Mandela and Mbeki. And then, in the case of Ramaphosa and others, but Ramaphosa is again the best example. The Tenderpreneurs then re-entered politics, now having amassed a huge fortune and being able to shower favors on people, and buy favors as well, and thus come to further political prominence. But the political corruption story in South Africa, to some extent at least, begins and ends with Jacob Zuma. There are many well-documented cases of corruption, suspicion, and those aren't even to speak of suspicions people may have of other corrupt dealings that he entered into. Right. He received a fair amount of criticism for these sorts of things in the press. One, well, so a couple of facets, the next 2 points here. Party protection. Zuma, with all of the things he was accused of, siphoning money from the government for personal uses, being involved in all sorts of shady behavior and getting the government to protect him and cover up what he was doing, and again, creating these patronage networks where he showered favors upon his friends and family. In particular, the Gupta family, one of the wealthiest families in South Africa, was a close political client of Zuma, and some say a kind of bankroller of many of his shady operations. And Zuma's own children, and he had many children. Zuma has 4 official wives. He had probably more mistresses than people can keep track of. He has somewhere around 20 children from different wives and from different mistresses. Many of them are, were born to women he was not married to, but he was still the father. And Zuma's reputation for being politically corrupt goes back some time into the early part of the first decade of the 21st century. And a lot of this has to do, kind of his reputation for this is bound up with the perception that he is a sexual predator. And, that comes in part from his many, many amours. I'll get to the political cartoon in a second here if you've been staring at that like I have. This is, I think, very telling of the kind of reputation that Zuma came to have. The other aspect of this, and it's bound up with party protection to be sure, was that the political leaders in South Africa came to control the judiciary, to name figures as judges who were party figures, who were supportive of their efforts, and perhaps even some who had rendered judgments in favor of Zuma and others in the past, and now they were put into positions of even greater prominence, right? Now, the political cartoon that you see here, let me explain just some facets of it, right? This is obviously I'm glad that it's not more pornographic than it already is, because it's quite offensive. The cartoonist's name is Jonathan Shapiro. He was, in the 80s and early 90s, an anti-apartheid activist, someone of a fair amount of provenance. He's white, he's Jewish, but he went by the moniker Zapiro, with a Z or a Z. He styled Zuma as showerhead. Now, where does that come from? Well, in the early part of the first decade of the 21st century, around 2004, 2005, Mandela was indicted for rape. There was a trial that proceeded. It turns out that he was accused of raping a close family friend. And this woman was also HIV positive. And in the trial, when they, I guess, asked Zuma about this, about her being HIV positive, and, why would you have unprotected sex with a woman who was HIV positive, Zuma said, well, I took a shower afterwards to protect myself from getting AIDS, right? To protect myself from getting HIV, as if that would have done anything. And so, Shapiro wrote a series of political cartoons over several years, always depicting Zuma with the shower head above him. In this one, you can see that the ANC shouting "Go for it, boss!" To the ANC's left there, or rather to the ANC's right, our left, is the ANC Youth League, which had not yet been disbanded. To the right, you have the South African Communist Party, and then the Congress of South African Trade Unions, all of these organizations that supported and propped up the ANC in general. They are holding down Lady Justice, who was presented, of course, as an African woman. The scales of Lady Justice have fallen, and it's quite obvious that they were encouraging Zuma to rape her, right? And actually, several of these Zuma as rapist cartoons were written by Jonathan Shapiro in succession over the course of several years. And he wrote a lot of other cartoons as well, but this was one that was tremendously controversial. Zuma sued the Sunday Times, for which Shapiro wrote, and as well as several other press outlets, and in this way attempted to suppress the press in general, right? There was more to the suppression of the press, though, than just these lawsuits that Zuma issued against, any number of press outlets. The ANC also, and this is where kind of the party apparatus and the dominance the ANC had creates problems. ANC also passed a number of laws that curtailed in some way the freedom of the press. The most notorious of these was called the Protection of State Information Bill. This went popularly as the Secrecy Bill, which gave the government the ability to pronounce anything that they deemed, somewhat revealing, or anything that they wanted to really, as classified. There were very vague rules in this regard, and so this was, in a way, a kind of copy of a law that had existed under apartheid and the suppression of the press in that period, and this led to a tremendous amount of controversy and criticism leveled against the ANC for this. Both Mbeki and Zuma, I should say, this was after the time of Mbeki. The bill itself was introduced in 2010, but Mbeki and Zuma both, had issues with the press and at times expressed outrage at the, the unfairness of the press. I guess the equivalent of, what Donald Trump would call fake news. That's kind of what they were talking about. They felt that the press treated them unfairly, and they did things to suppress this. And this 2010 bill was really quite controversial. And the press cried foul. The international observers criticized this, but the ANC often responded, to say that, well, the press had been infiltrated by spies and foreign intelligence agents, and and the South Africa itself was threatened by these things, and so we've got to have the ability to protect the information of our government from exposure, and so that the defense of this bill ended up sort of verging into conspiracy theory. And Zuma, I believe, did sign the bill ultimately after a great deal. I mean, it passed the Parliament, the National Assembly, and in fact, the ANC members, and there were some who objected to this, were disciplined by the party. And so this was another way to suppress opposition, was that ANC members who spoke out against Zuma were often either dismissed from their positions or censured in some other way. And then, the main method of suppressing opposition from outside of the party was to use the race card, to simply declare them to be racists. And these accusations were often leveled against black people just as they were against white people. Even such figures as Helen Suzman, the former progressive member of parliament who had fought against every apartheid law passed by the apartheid government, was declared by the ANC to be a racist because she had joined up with the uh, Congress of the People, and was becoming an outspoken critic of the government. So all of that really left a bad taste in a lot of South Africans' mouths, but the ANC still enjoyed an unparalleled amount of popularity. Their margins of victory in elections have been narrowing, but they're nowhere close to losing a majority of the votes. And one of the great questions that I think we need to ask about South Africa at this point is, how long is the ANC going to hold on to power? Because I think, in the minds of any impartial observer, anyone who can see what's going on, South Africa has become a one-party state, and the stability of the country, its ability to progress and not sort of lapse into continued cronyism, is going to be dependent on having a viable opposition. A couple other points briefly. Foreign policy is an important theme of the last couple of decades. It's one where there have been some successes at the same time as there have been some setbacks or some things to criticize leaders of South Africa. Thabo Mbeki spent a great deal of time outside of the country, traveling all over the world, but especially to other countries in Africa, and trying to present South Africa as a kind of beacon to the rest of the continent, an example that others should follow. One that was governing responsibly and trying to bring betterment to the lives of its people, to eradicate poverty, to deal with disease and lack of infrastructure, right? And so Mbeki styled this as an African Renaissance. That's what he wanted to bring about. Mbeki was an outspoken critic of the over-dependence that many African countries had on foreign aid. A little bit ironic, given that South Africa was desperate to attract foreigners, but not in the sense of just aid, but rather foreign investment, right? So, he felt that Africans should solve their own problems and should not continue to be dependent on, especially the Western world, the United States and Western Europe, for propping up things that the people should be able to, and the government should be able to do for themselves. And so Mbeki, after he retired from political life, after he stepped down as president, spent much of his time with his foundation. He occasionally did make public appearances and gave lots of interviews. I heard him a number of times over the last 12 years or so, after his retirement his resigning from the presidency, giving interviews even on American news outlets. So Mbeki especially was extremely involved in foreign policy. The one major black mark on the foreign policy operations of both Mbeki and Zuma is the coddling of Zimbabwe. Right. So you have pictured here in the lower left, Thabo Mbeki in the front, and right behind him in the gray suit is Robert Mugabe, the liberation struggle leader in the 1960s and 70s against the independent government of Rhodesia, and the first and, well, for a long time, only elected president in Zimbabwe's history. Mugabe held on to power for way too long, until he was well into his 90s, and absolutely ran the country into the ground, enacted a number of unilateral and very controversial policies like forced land redistribution and other things. His economic decisions were disastrous. Zimbabwe suffered from absolutely runaway inflation. The Zimbabwe government at one point was printing, I believe, 1 trillion Zimbabwe dollar bills that were nearly useless, really not worth the paper they were printed on, right? And their currency collapsed at least once, maybe multiple times. And Mugabe also held onto power in quite shady ways, manipulating election results, imprisoning political opponents. When the Zimbabwe elections were obviously rigged, in the second half of the first decade of the 21st century, and then again a few years after this. Thabo Mbeki, who was one who could easily mediate, not easily, but the best position to mediate the situation and try to talk some sense into Mugabe and get him to step down, or at least stop interfering with the election results. Instead, Mbeki protected Mugabe and hailed him as a great liberation leader, and did absolutely nothing to mitigate the unfairness of these elections. And for the most part, Zuma continued along the same lines. Mugabe was eventually removed from power, and Zimbabwe is, under new leadership, but really no thanks to South Africa at all. Another area that we might say is successful, and I brought this up earlier, so I won't belabor the point, but the involvement in BRICS. This is a multinational organization of economic cooperation. It stands, as I said earlier, for each of the countries involved in this: Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. They have tried to set up various agencies to mimic the activities of NATO, and the Schengen agreements, and the European Union, and even the United Nations to some extent, to try to offer countries, especially in the developing world, some alternative. But on the other hand, the loyalty that the South African government had to China as a result of their close economic cooperation with them at times took the country and its political leaders into scandal. On at least two occasions, invitations issued to the Dalai Lama to attend, on one occasion at least, Desmond Tutu's 80th birthday celebration, and another to attend a conference of Nobel laureates. His visa, or rather his visitor application, was delayed, and the Dalai Lama on both occasions ended up withdrawing his intent to visit South Africa. Desmond Tutu himself became an outspoken critic of the government on this score. But South Africa has become one of China's most important trading partners on the continent, and the Chinese have poured funds into development in South Africa in exchange for political favors, and especially for natural resources. China is doing, of course, similar things all over the African continent. But to the international community, this is highly problematic, and even to many within South Africa, this is another point of criticism. South Africa remains, unfortunately, mired in inequality. Is it more unequal than it was under apartheid? Well, it's difficult to say, right? There are certain measurables that show that the gap between the rich and poor has actually grown over the last 25 years. And that, of course, is highly problematic. There still is very much a racial divide in the terms of economic inequality. That white people tend to have much lower unemployment. Only a small percentage of white people are unemployed at this point. There are some notable examples of extreme white poverty, right? There are shanty towns which are inhabited almost solely by white people. So there is a white poor, but given that whites at this point only make up about 10% of the population of the country, it's not a large or very visible group, and it certainly doesn't have any kind of political patronage representing it. But whites still are in control of much of the economy, and other sort of key facets of South African society, and tend, to be wealthier and have greater opportunities for education. But South Africa has made strides. The emergence of a black middle class, and even a number of extremely wealthy black elites, partly through being tenderpreneurs, but some others as well, right, has changed this. And so there has emerged, unfortunately, in the place of racial apartheid, an economic gap, right? A gap between rich and poor, that has everything to do with access to opportunities, to political patronage, and the corruption of Zuma and others has not helped this whatsoever. Millions and millions of South Africans still live in abject poverty, have little hope of gaining gainful employment, end up frequently involved as a result in crime. There are places where which are almost entirely unpoliced, which may actually be a welcome thing given the bad reputation the police have. But there are neighborhoods that verge on anarchy in some places, and there are other places, both in the urban and rural spaces, where people live with no access to any of the comforts of life, where they still live very much the same kind of existence, as their ancestors did several centuries ago, but with, of course, modernity surrounding it, right? So the contrast is really stark in South Africa. South Africa tends to rank extremely low among developed or more developing countries. It doesn't, it's often ranked against developed countries. That's part of the problem, but it tends to rank last or very close to the end of many indexes of which it is a part. And the inequality and the level of crime and other things are the main reasons for this. And so I close this video, and in fact this entire course, with some images, right? South Africa has done incredible things. The overcoming of apartheid, the stellar political career of Nelson Mandela, and others like him, Oliver Tambo, Walter Sisulu, even Thabo Mbeki, at least before the latter part of his presidency, right? These are all incredibly commendable. They're wonderful stories. I mean, these are some of my heroes. South Africa has enjoyed really proud moments where the euphoria of the end of apartheid and the establishment of democracy has come back, and the country has felt unified. Maybe the best example of this was South Africa hosting the FIFA World Cup in 2010, right? The picture at the top left here is of one of the venues, and the pride in the South African national team. They produced hundreds of thousands of these little plastic trumpets called vuvuzelas, which is a kind of mass marketing of a traditional instrument. These put out incredible noise. I can still hear in my mind the vuvuzelas blowing as I was watching the World Cup. I was not in South Africa, but watching it on television. The tournament was a smashing success. It was marked by peace. There was little problem with all of the international visitors there. No, hardly very few instances of crime. The South African team was eliminated in the first round, but they did, win a great victory over the French national team. And they, drew with Mexico in the opening match of the tournament. And even though they lost to Uruguay went on to be a semifinalist there. The South Africans ended up cheering heartily for Ghana, another African country that made it pretty far in the tournament. In fact, I'll happily say that was robbed by Uruguay when, one of the Uruguayan players, Luis Suarez, cleared the ball off of the goal, what would have been the winning goal, with his hand. And then the penalty kick subsequently was missed. Anyway, I'm not reliving too much the World Cup there. But, this was a great success, and South Africans felt tremendous pride in the accomplishment of their country. Jacob Zuma basked in the glory of all of this. Nelson Mandela himself, who was suffering from dementia at the time and was quite ill, attended the final match. And seeing Mandela there and enjoying the pride of South Africa was, made every single South African happy, I think, to be part of that country. And those, others like me who have a great love for South Africa and count it as a kind of second home. Um, uh, on the other hand, we have things like the scandals of Jacob Zuma. His sprawling home complex in Kandla, which he used millions and millions of rands of government money to improve. This included, and this was all, the party said this was all for security provisions to be put in place, but 30 million rand or more, certainly is probably more than was needed for security. And in fact, they uncovered evidence of, him putting in things like a horse corral and a massive like chicken run. I mean, this is a farming complex, he said, after all, but a swimming pool. His wife ran a snack shop. One of his wives did, and that was on the campus of his massive homestead. And Kandla ended up as one of the political scandals that brought him down. Right, that really sort of indicated the kind of politician that Jacob Zuma was. This is another Zapiro political cartoon, but this is the criticism of them rejecting the Dalai Lama when they were happy to endorse obvious dictators like Omar al-Bashir of Sudan, who had been accused of genocide in Darfur, and South Africa called for him to be protected and not turned over to the International Criminal Court. The last picture here is of the burial of Nelson Mandela. Mandela died in December 2013. I remember this very, very clearly, and for me, it's one of the indelible moments, I think, of my adult life. That my personal hero, passed from this earth. But this is another moment where South Africans could really sort of take stock of who they were, of what happened, where people came from all over the world to pay tribute to arguably the greatest man of the 20th century, maybe one of the truly greats in all of history, and to point a path forward for South Africa and for the world that would hopefully embrace the courage, the dedication, and the integrity of Nelson Mandela. Jacob Zuma, by the way, was booed at the funeral. The Nkandla scandal and other things had really weighed him down at that point. He would go on the next year, by the way, to win another election before, being forced to resign in disgrace 3 years later. But, so Zuma, was not able to kind of command, to stage manage this whole thing. It was all about Nelson Mandela and Barack Obama, and other world leaders came and praised Mandela, gave speeches at his memorial service. It's a remarkable moment that brought former political rivals together. To see Barack Obama shake the hand of Raul Castro of Cuba was a remarkable moment, and it was someone like Mandela, I think, only who could bring about something like this, where people were willing to suspend their animosity and just celebrate the life of this great man and the country that he had brought about through his actions and the actions of others who participated with him. So hopefully you have been able to take away from the history of South Africa something that is meaningful to you and something that you can use to go forward, either as a guide for your own pattern of living, or perhaps some as a cautionary tale for what happens when people give in to hatred and prejudice and things like this. So I've enjoyed this course, and I hope that you have as well. Thank you.